Praise the Lord! Magandang araw po sa inyong lahat. Ito po ang Moments with God. At ako po ang iyong makakasama, Presbyter Raquel Dela Cruz. At kung paanong tinatalakay po sa linggong ito ang temang courage, pinamagatan ko po ang aking topic, Where True Courage Comes From. Where does courage come from? And when we need it most, where can we get it? Sa ating pong buhay, dumarating ang mga takot, ang mga pangamba, ang mga kabalisahan, na minsan nag-aakay sa tao para sumuko sa laban ng buhay. Pero meron nga bang pinanggagalingan ang tapang upang magpatuloy sa laban na ito ng buhay? At this point, I would like to discuss to you and have a Bible character study in the life of David. And from this, let us understand where true courage comes from. It was more than 3,000 years ago in the valley of Elah. There was that massive man named Goliath. And he stepped out in the Philistine ranks. And every time, he defied the army of Israel and even God himself. And for 40 days, he was aggressively speaking before the warriors of Israel. And no one dared to fight. But every time this giant stepped forward, the warriors of Israel shrunk back and stepped back. But this teenage Hebrew shepherd boy named David was told by his father, go there and learn the condition of your brothers who are soldiers. Because the big brothers of David were soldiers. And when he went there bringing with him the bread and the cheese, he heard those scornful words of giant Goliath. And when he heard those words, he was so indignant. He took his slingshot with small stones in his hand, and he was able to kill Goliath and chop off his head. But this story is not just about what people think about it. Many think that David's defeat over Goliath was about his personal courage in the face of an overwhelming odds. They see David as a very typical underdog, standing up in an arrogant Goliath. They see him as a self-confident, a young man who is willing to fight for what is right and relying on his own strength and skills, rather on the conforming on the conventional tactics. Remember, when David fought, he was not wearing the armor of a warrior. When David fought, he was handling with him a slingshot and few stones with him. But it's not all about the story. It's true that David was courageous. And courage is an essential virtue. But when he faced Goliath, his courage was a derivative virtue. It was being empowered by something else. And when we say derivative, it's not something which is inherent in him. It is not something that is in him. It is not the very nature of David. It was something empowered to him. But that is not at all what the story is about. Dito po nagkakaroon ng maling pagtingin ang marami. Totoo po, napagtagumpayan at nalabanan ni David si Goliath. Pero hindi po ito umaayon doon sa iniisip ng iba na ito ay personal na tapang ni David. Na ito ay bunga ng kanyang tiwala sa kanyang sarili o noong kanyang skill Pero ang marami pong kaisipang ito ay hindi ayon sa tunay na kwento sa buhay ni David. Opo, yes, David was courageous. And this courage is an essential virtue. When he faced Goliath, this courage is a derivative virtue. It is being empowered by something else. When we say derivative, may pinanggagalingan po, may pinagmulan. At ang tapang ni David ay hindi bunga ng kanyang tiwala sa kanyang sarili. Ang tapang ni David ay hindi sapagkat he was a skillful man or a shepherd boy. Kung titingnan po natin, he could have worn the armor of a warrior, pero ang dala-dala po ni David ay ang isang simpleng tirador ng isang bata na pastol ng tupa. And who could ever win in this fight? Having just a slingshot with you and small stones with you. Pero nais ko po makita natin sa mga pagkakataong ito, saan nga po ba nanggaling ang courage ni David? At bago po natin tignan ang katotohanan ito, maaring maitanong natin, bakit si Saul at ang mga mandirigma ni Saul ay waring kinapos sa katapangang hinihingi sa mga pagkakataong ito? Ito po ay ating mababasa dito sa unang Samuel, 17 ang talatay 24. At lahat ng mga lalaki sa Israel, pagkakita sa lalaking yaon, ay tumakas mula sa kanyang harapan at natakot na mainam. Sa tuwing makikita po nila si Goliath, sabi ng banal na kasulatan, sila'y tumatakas at natatakot na mainam. And this is something which is in contrary. Sapagkat kung tutuusin, sila'y mandirigma, sila'y mga kawal, sila'y mga sundalo na hinasa sa pakikipaglaban. Pero sa panahon po na makita nila si Goliath, kinukulong sila ng takot. At dahilan dito, sila'y tumatakas. At sa unang tingin, at a glance, parang iisipin natin, it was because of who Goliath was that made them shrunk back and step back. Bakit po? Paano nga po ba nilarawan ng banal na kasulatan kung sino si Goliath? In 1 Samuel 17, verses 4-7, in the Message version, it says, a giant nearly 10 feet tall stepped out from the Philistine line into the open. Goliath from Gath, he had a bronze helmet on his head and was dressed in armor, 126 pounds of it. He wore bronze shin guards and carried a bronze sword. His spear was like a fence rail. The spear tip alone weighed over 15 pounds. His shield bearer walked ahead of him. He was a trained warrior. He was too strong, bearing with him the armor of a soldier, weighing 126 pounds. Yun lang pong turbante sa ulo ni Goliath at yung baluti sa kanyang katawan, ang bigat po nito ay 126 pounds, na kung ating titingnan is more or less 57 kilos. At ang dulo ng sibat na ginagamit ni Goliath ay may bigat na 15 pounds, which is more or less 7 kilos. Kung ito ang nasa katawan ni Goliath, ibig sabihin, hindi lamang hinubog si Goliath bilang mandirigma. Si Goliath ay mayroong malakas na pangangatawan upang lumaban sa pagdirigma. Kung ating titignan sa kalagayan pong ito, no one dared among the warriors of Israel. Goliath was physically trained, and Goliath was physically strong. And physically, every man in the Hebrew camp, every warrior of Israel was a mismatch. Fighting Goliath looked like a suicide. Ito ang unang dating ng mga pangyayari. At ito ang waring parang dahilan upang ang mga kawal ng Israel, ang mga mandirigma ng Israel, at maging si Saul ay mawalan ng katapangan at kulungin ng takot. Pero hindi po ito ang malalim na dahilan. The problem is not about Goliath. The problem is with Saul and the warriors of Israel. Because at that moment, what they lack is not training. What they lacked is not the strength of the warrior. What they lack is their faith in God. And what did Saul and the warriors of Israel lack? They did not lack training. They did not lack the strength as a warrior. They lacked their faith in God. And they saw Goliath bigger than God. And each man believed that if they will fight Goliath, they were just putting their lives on death. What made David different from the rest? If we will look back, the warriors of Israel were more qualified for this fight because David was just a young shepherd boy. He knew nothing about battle. He was not trained as a warrior. But what did David has? He has the faith in God. Ito ang mayroon kay David na wala sa kanila. It's not about the height of Goliath. It's not about the strength of Goliath. It's about the faith of David. At nang si David ay sumampalataya, nakita niya kung sino ang Diyos. Nakilala niya kung sino ang Diyos. Nasampalatayanan niya kung sino ang Diyos. Kasama ng pangako ng Diyos at ng kanyang kapangyarihan, natuparin ang mga pangako ito. At dahilan sa katotohanan ito, David was not a self-confident shepherd boy. David was a God-confident warrior of God. He might not be a warrior before the eyes of the people during those days. But God made him a warrior because of his trust and faith in God. Ano po ang kaisipan ni David? Kung sinamahan siya ng Diyos noon, sasamahan siya ng Diyos ngayon. And fighting against Goliath, he was rest assured that God will give him the victory. And when he did, what was demonstrated is the very power and faithfulness of God and not David's courage. Nang manalo po si David sa labang ito kay Goliath, ang nahayag po ay ang kapangyarihan at ang katapatan ng Diyos, hindi ang katapangan ni David. Purihin ang Panginoon. And when David heard about how this Goliath defied God and his people, he stepped forward and he fought. And God fought for him, and victory was given to him. In the eyes of faith of David, David saw God bigger stronger than Goliath. Sa mata po ng pananampalataya ni David, nakita niya na ang Diyos na kanyang pinaglilingkuran at sinasampalatayanan, which is the very wellspring of his courage, is bigger and stronger than Goliath. Kailan nga po ba na ang balon ay nauubusan ng tubig? Kailan nga po ba na ang bukal ay nauubusan ng tubig? But the wellspring of David's courage is not himself. The very wellspring of David's courage was not a self-confident type. It was about God, whom he rests his faith. At ang sabi po sa unang Samuel 17, ang talatay 46 hanggang 47, sa araw na ito ay ibibigay ka ng Panginoon sa aking kamay, at sasaktan kita, at pupugutin ko ang ulo mo, at ibibigay ko ang mga bangkay mo sa hukbo ng mga Filisteo, sa mga ibon sa himpapawid sa araw na ito, at sa mababangis na hayop sa lupa, upang maalaman ng buong lupa na may Diyos sa Israel, at upang maalaman ng buong kapisanang ito na hindi nagliligtas ang Panginoon sa pamamagitan ng tabak o sibat, sapagkat ang pagbabakang ito ay sa Panginoon, at ibibigay niya kayo sa aming kamay. Sa mga talatang ito, makikita natin, there was that irony in the victory of David over Goliath. Ano po yung irony? That David was able to kill Goliath by simply handing in him a slingshot and some small pebble. Sabi ng salita ng Panginoon, sapagkat ang pagbabakang ito ay sa Panginoon, at ibibigay niya kayo sa aming kamay. When we put our trust and faith in God, this unquenchable courage comes in us that we will be able to face everything that we are going through. This is your moments with God. Are there giants in your life that bring fears and worries, na parang gusto mong sumuko sa laban ng buhay? Remember, courage is derivative. It is not self-generated. True courage comes from the Lord, and we can have it when we need it most, when we put our faith in God. Sa panahon pong ito, maaaring maraming bagay ang parang gaya ng Goliath na maaaring kumulong sa atin sa takot, sa kabalisahan, sa mga pag-aalinlangan. Pero tandaan po natin, God is bigger than those trials. God is bigger than those problems. God is bigger than our worries and fears and doubts. And we can conquer all this when we find ourselves getting the courage we need, not out of our own, but that from the wellspring from God when we put our faith in Him. Unawain po natin at ating pong tandaan, si Goliath ay namatay at napatay ni David. Hindi dahil sa maliit na bato. Si Goliath ay napatay ni David sapagkat mayroong siyang malaking Diyos na kanyang pinagkakatiwalaan. To God be the glory. Para po sa ating Bible verse, ito po ay ating masusumpungan sa Deuteronomy 31 verse 16. Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, He is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Kayo'y magpakalakas at magpakatapang. Huwag kayong matakot ni mangilabot sa kanila, Sapagkat ang Panginoon mong Diyos ay siyang yumayaong kasama mo, hindi kanya iiwan ni pababayaan man. Sa mga talatang ito, what assures us to be courageous is not what we have at hand, is not what we can see, but rather with the invincible God who has His faithful promise that I will never leave you, neither forsake you. Mauunawaan po natin ang magpakalakas at magpakatapang kapag alam natin kung sino ang ating kasama. The one who is with us is not men. Maaari po may kasama tayo at maaaring tapat ang ating kasama. Pero lagi po nating tatandaan, ang tao'y tao. And we have our limitations as human. Pero salamat po, gaya ng sinabi ng banal na kasulatan, ang kasama natin ay ang Diyos. At ang Diyos na kasama natin ay may pangako. Sabi ng kanyang mga salita, hindi kita iiwan, hindi kita pababayaan. At ang pangako pong ito ng Panginoon is not true in the sunny days of our lives. Is not true when we are on our smooth sailing in our journey. Ang pangako po ng Panginoon na hindi kita iiwan at hindi kita pababayaan ay lalong higit na totoo sa panahon na ang ating paglalakbay ay waring mabato, waring mahirap, at sa panahong ito, ang Diyos ang kasama natin. Purihin ng Panginoon, pagpalain po kayong lahat ng ating Panginoon.
Thank you for watching Moments with God. If you enjoyed the video, click like and subscribe for more uploads.